Okay, everyone, why don't we get started? And we're here today to discuss cybersecurity policy development, which is apparently tricky to say, why it's so important for organizations to have it, and what you need to do to get it set up right. So we're going to start today with a little housekeeping. Just one moment. A few things that everybody should know. Right now, everybody other than the panelists are muted and have your videos off. You can use the Q&A function to post any questions you might have and put them in the chat if you'd like. Raise your hand. We'll be answering all those towards the end of the webinar. And if there's any we don't get to, we'll be putting them into our cybersecurity community. There we'll also be posting the slides, the recordings, a copy of any questions people may have, and we can further discuss what you need to do to have good cybersecurity policies. So with that, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Joanne Tartaglino, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Analyst here at PamTen. And I'd like to introduce you to our first panelist, John Mendes.
Great, thanks, Joanne. Thanks, everyone, for taking time out of your day to spend with us. We hope you're going to find today's session informative and interesting. My name is John Mendes, and I manage the cybersecurity practice at PamTen. If you're new to PamTen or our cybersecurity community, I encourage you to check us out at PamTen.com and visit our cybersecurity community. We're fortunate today to have Don Philmlee with us. Don has extensive experience working as a cybersecurity consultant and project manager. Don, care to say a few words?
Just glad to be here, John, Joanne. My background is I've provided technology consulting to small businesses and mid-sized businesses, as well as professional service firms for the last 30 years. So security, project management, it's depending on the era, was the technology we were doing consulting on. So, but glad to be here.
Okay, thanks. All right, Joanne, you want to put up the agenda? We'll quickly go through that and then get started.
Okay, and due to technical difficulties, my computer just froze. Hold on a moment, please. There we go.
There it is.
Yeah. All right, so let's quickly review what's on the agenda for this webinar. We'll start by reviewing what a policy is and is not, and why your organization should have a portfolio of policies tailored to your business. We'll spend some time talking about the different security frameworks that exist and how do you select the right one. And then we'll wrap up and talk about how you can begin to put together a plan to create your policies.
Okay, so when we hear the phrase cybersecurity policy, or even just the phrase policy, I think of documentation, lots and lots of documentation, and it's all legal and technical, and as I heard it put, makes wonderful sleeping reading materials. How do we address that?
Well, I mean, if policies, when they're done correctly, I mean, they're extremely valuable. They're the rules, the processes, the controls that you put in place to safeguard your data and your information.
Yeah, and sure, there might be bedtime reading in some cases, but some of that detail is good. But what a well-written policy doesn't have to be bedtime reading. I mean, it does have to have legalese in it here and there to discuss things, but it has to cover things that people understand. So it's not necessarily bedtime reading in the end, or it shouldn't be.
I mean, and they're important for managing risk and helping to mitigate that risk across the organization, whether it's compliance risk or a risk to the brand or the reputation of the organization. I mean, and what they do is they help to show customers, suppliers, and the regulators that you're taking a proactive approach to protecting your information. I mean, without a security policy, you're working in the blind. I mean, it's like driving down the road at night with no lights on.
It's a rule book for you and your company.
And the value really goes beyond just security. I mean, organizations that can successfully implement an effective policy program They improve governance. They do a better job across the organization. Managers and frontline employees have a better understanding and clear instructions of what they should be doing and should not be doing. And the organization is also in a better position to respond to compliance requirements and audits. They help to limit liability and litigation on all fronts in the event of a data breach or a successful cybersecurity attack.
Yeah, they're very important. I mean, in terms of looking at as a real life example of that is I was involved years ago with I got a call from somebody who had a problem where an internal person had accessed intellectual property that they weren't supposed to get access to, but and it resulted us spending an entire weekend trying to figure out if this person did actually have it and could they prove they had access to it. But in the end, there wasn't any policies in place that governed whether or not this person, even if they could get access to it, which they did, they couldn't do anything about it because there wasn't any law broken. It was just internal. And so there was no rule book by which the organization could deal with it. So in a real life example of that is, if you don't have a rule book, anybody can do anything and get away with it.
I mean, that's true. I mean, and also what it helps to do is it sets the right tone across the organization. I mean, it helps to increase accountability. The workforce knows what they're responsible for. They know how to take certain actions and when to take those actions.
Right.
So I think the overall, security posture of the organization improves, helping to reduce security incidents, increasing application, availability and uptime. And it also helps to reduce the amount of time taken to respond to any type of a security event or incident.
Well, that just goes to show that how important policies can be. And if they're so important, well, then why doesn't every organization have them?
Good question, right?
Especially nowadays.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of organizations struggle on where to start. There are many security frameworks out there. There's a lot of security control catalogs to choose from, but picking the right one can be confusing. I mean, selecting the right framework that's important to your organization does take some time and effort. I think a lot of organizations also get bogged down. They try to create a policy for everything, or they create one overarching policy in an attempt to try to cover every possible scenario, and that's not really the best approach.
Right. It's you got to keep it simple. Otherwise it's not going to be useful, or it's going to be too unwieldy. As you're pointing out, John, people can make these policies too unwieldy to enforce, because if it's too much, people don't understand what they're supposed to do or what they're not supposed to do, because it's confusing. And so it really needs to be focused in on things that are easy to read and implement and can easily be enforced.
That's a good point. I mean, some organizations try to create these policies, as you mentioned earlier, Joanne, that are sleeping material. I mean, multiple pages of technical documentation that the end user who's reading this really doesn't understand it. And I mean, that's something to keep in mind. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, that writing a policy is no different than preparing any kind of presentation material. I mean, you need to keep the audience in mind and really tailor it to who the audience is.
Well, let's get a little specific. What is a policy?
Well, I mean, they're the foundation of your cybersecurity program. Right? As Don mentioned, they help to add structure. They define the what and the why certain actions are required.
Well, and then they also have to be broad enough in scope that they can be, they can apply not just to a single department, but maybe to a whole organization, right? So I mean, it's a careful balance that has to be done. It's easier seen. I mean, once you've seen a set of policies that are well written, then you know what it is. It's sort of like if you see it, you know it, but if you don't see it, it's kind of hard to describe.
I mean, think of it as a directive, a rule, or a mandate that the management team has decided to implement. It should clearly identify what management's intent is, why this is being asked of their employees, and really what's the background there, right? So it isn't just that management is mandated that a certain action be taken or a certain activity followed, but the reasoning behind that. Why is it being done? I mean, policies really need to be documented. I mean, we work with a lot of organizations who have a management directed mandate, and when we've asked them for a policy, there really is none, or it's a brief email of what should be done or should not be done.
Right.
It's important to keep in mind that policies need to be documented, they need to be taught, and they need to be enforced.
Agreed.
And,
Yep.
and that's interesting because you mentioned that some organizations combine like policies and procedures and processes into one overarching document. But why is that wrong?
Well, unfortunately, some people, when they refer to a policy, they really mean a standard or a procedure, and that kind of creates some confusion when you start talking about creating documentation. I think this slide helps to kind of identify what's the difference there between a policy, a standard, a procedure, and what's called a control objective, which is nothing more than just a set of conditions that need to be met in order to ensure that certain actions are being taken. But I mean, at the high level, the policy is the formally established requirement that helps to guide what needs to be done, what actions and what behavior. The control objectives are really around, how are you going to implement the things that you say that you're monitoring, or the things that you say that you're preventing or controlling.
Well, and then it all comes down to procedures, though, too. I mean, at the bottom as well. So because you need to have a method of doing things based on, what in a certain order, a manner that might be prescribed by law, or prescribed by what you're trying to protect. I mean, the whole point of cybersecurity is to be able to protect something, and the whole point of policy and then standards and procedures is to come down to something tangible that people can do and provide as an organization that allows people to act, in an appropriate manner, and in a way that's defensible by not only the organization to their clients, but in a way that where an employee can say, well, look, I followed the rules, or I followed the policies and procedures. So it has to be, as you said, John, definitely understandable, but in a way that's it has to be trained to people as well.
That's a good point, Don. I mean, think of the procedures as the how, right? So how is the organization going to enforce whatever's been defined in the policy? And I think it's important to understand the differences, because I mean it can become confusing.
Right. Well, a lot of times things are patchwork, right? And these taking a formal approach to producing policies and procedures really removes that patchwork and makes it more cohesive.
Well, we've got a poll that we're going to ask everybody to give us a quick answer to. It's a simple one. What are the biggest drivers for the need for security policies in your organization? Is it regulatory or legislative compliance, information security concerns, mandated by management, client or supplier? Or if it's something different or all of the above, then give us a shout out in the chat. We'll just give it a moment. Well, it seems like everybody seems to be information security concerns. That seems to be a lot of the interest here. And nowadays, it's not unusual for people to be concerned about security.
Well, I think also the regulatory and compliance things where you having to comply to some law are driven largely by whatever industry you're in, and also by typically by client demand. So
very true. Very true.
Yeah, and some people just don't have that. I mean, there's no requirement for that. So,
but just because there's no requirement for it doesn't mean they shouldn't have it. So right. If you're going to start, where do you start when you want to create a policy, a security policy?
Yep.
Well, I think a critical step is looking at a security framework. I mean, the heavy lifting has already been done. I mean, the security framework describes what the organization needs to do to manage whatever that risk is or adhere to whatever that compliance requirement is. I mean, leveraging a framework or multiple ones, if it's necessary, and some organizations do, I mean, it helps the organization to develop a more mature approach to security.
Yeah, it gives you something to hang off of. I mean, so often I've worked with folks in coming up with policies, and I mean they start with their existing set of policies, and that's not a bad approach, but a better way to do it is what you're talking about, John, where you have a framework, and then you can take the requirements that the business has and start hanging it off that framework, because then you get more of a, as we say in the bullet points there, you can instill more confidence with the stakeholders that you're aligning your needs to industry best practices. So,
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it builds that foundation. And the important thing to remember is that, again, all the heavy lifting has been done. The challenge here is picking the right framework for your organization, and then having the having the wherewithal to get it implemented and to enforce it.
that's right.
So as you can see, there are a lot of security frameworks out there. I think the last time I checked, there was something like over 200 security frameworks that were in use. But really only a handful have been widely adopted. I mean, some of these frameworks were developed for specific industries or to satisfy an individual compliance requirement.
Right.
Some of these frameworks, I mean, they're very, very complex. Others are very, very simple and basic to implement.
So there are some common ones, though, John, that are easily used, or more commonly used, more used by everybody, right? Which ones are those?
Yeah, Nist and ISO
Yeah.
tend to be the most commonly used frameworks. I mean, they both cover the same foundational building blocks that you're going to need to put together a program, but they differ. They differ in content and the layout. I mean, each one has its benefits and drawbacks. The
other thing, I know the other thing that you see in these frameworks too is governments, not just the United States government or other, but a lot of overseas governments have spent a lot of time and effort putting together frameworks for them. And so a lot of times you look at these frameworks and go, they're related to a government standard or government standards. And so it's not always appropriate, but it meant, like you said, John, there's a myriad of these things out there available for, and one would fit somewhere in what you're trying to do.
And I think, Don, that also adds to the confusion, right? So when you think about GDPR, or you think about some of the privacy laws that have been implemented in Canada and elsewhere, you may look at that and say, well, is that really a framework? Is that a security framework, or is that a regulatory compliance requirement that I need to meet?
Or are they just best practices, or or just guidelines? I mean, they're just, sometimes they don't provide methodologies. They provide just a statement of something, and you're left going, is that it? How are you supposed to do that? But I mean, the nice part is, as we're going to get into in a little bit, you can mix and match, right? Some of these things if you need to fit what you need. But
sure. Okay. So let's start with Nist. So Nist 800-171. It was published back in 2017 as a federal requirement for companies that wanted to do business with the U.S. government. And until last December, all a contractor needed to do was to just basically self-attest and say that that they were compliant, or that they were actively working towards implementing what those controls are.
Right.
That all changed in December. I mean, Don, as you know, contractors now not only need to have a security plan in place, and that's a document, not necessarily a brief explanation, but a formal document in place. They also need to have a plan of action that describes not only their network, but how they're going to achieve 100% compliance if they're not. They need to go through a new self-assessment process that's based on a new scoring system. And it's not only true of the prime contractors, but but any of the subcontractors that those prime contractors engage, or any of the suppliers. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it impacts, and now, I mean, that's trickled down. It didn't used to apply to contractors, but now, and suppliers, but now it does. So the government's getting involved more in that. I mean, it's all about the government locking down and trying to create a more secure environment for themselves as well. But not only that, but with the advent of a lot of work, at least in the United States, a lot of work in the federal government is being done with contractors. You got to make sure that those people are meeting the same standards that you want your government agencies to have.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we're finding that that's a pretty big challenge for a lot of smaller suppliers. Companies that really haven't given a lot of thought to cybersecurity or any of these control frameworks. Now they need to follow this process, and they need to prove that they're compliant.
Right.
They need to have a plan in place of how they're going to get there. And I think the thing that separates Nist from ISO, and Don, you can help to correct me here a little bit, but I think Nist focuses more on the security controls. It tends to be more technical rather than risk-based.
Right. ISO doesn't tend to do that. They tend to be more framework organization where they cover a diversity of risk mitigation. But Nist seems to be really, sometimes Nist gets down in the weeds real quick in talking about what has to be done. I mean, I think it covers 110 some controls.
Yeah, across 14 categories.
Yeah, 14 categories. Yeah. What's another one? I know we have another one coming up on the next slide.
There. So when we talk about ISO, as you mentioned, Don, it tends to be more risk-based and less technical in nature. The thing that's confusing about ISO 27001 is that it's really at the high level, and it's really focused on helping an organization put together a plan of how they're going to manage information security. And it really only provides like a brief overview of the controls. And it's obviously a good reference. It's a good foundation to begin with. But 27002 is really what provides the detail. And that's really what you need to put together any type of an effective program. 27002, it's considered a supplemental framework, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I guess to help keep things simple, 27001 lays the framework, lays the foundation, and then 27002 contains all the actual details of what you need to put in place in order to be compliant.
Right, and they just added that. I mean, it's nice that they've because 27001 was a little light on detail, and so to have that additional detail to help nail down what you're supposed to be doing is very useful. I mean, ISO is a large international standards organization, and they do a lot of different things, not just cybersecurity, but they do like electrical engineering and also manufacturing. They do all sorts of everything. Standards processing. So sometimes I wonder if they don't. I have wondered in the past if they haven't focused very hard on cybersecurity, but in the last few years, it seems like somebody's really been paying attention, and the ISO standards have gotten much better.
That's true. Okay, so just like there's confusion around policies, what's in a policy, there's confusion around what's contained inside of a framework. So we've done here was just listed out, this is a Gartner slide, I believe, just listed out some of the different elements here. I mean, the security framework provides the structure. I mean, it's the highest level. And as we mentioned earlier, you've got controls, and there's a control catalog with a list of specific technical controls that need to be implemented to basically do the things that your policy says you're going to do. And then you've got these security processes that are in place, and these tend to be independent or linked actions that need to be execute it in some type of a precise manner in order to achieve some, some security objective there.
Okay, you two gentlemen are very, very wise in the ways of cybersecurity. Are there any recommendations of how to select the right framework for you?
I think Don kind of touched on it on one of the earlier slides. And I mean, you need to really understand what your business needs to do. There's a misconception, I think, out there that you need to follow either Nist or ISO because those are the two, most commonly, followed frameworks. And that might not necessarily be true. I mean,
right. Each business, each company, each business, each organization is like a fingerprint. Yes, you can use other things from other places, but you can mix and match these things as you need to. I mean, that's the nice part. Once you've identified any contractual or regulatory requirements you have that you have to meet, those are posts in the sand, so to speak, that you've got to meet. But the rest of it all is just trying to figure out what best suits your particular business and what you're trying to do. I mean, the first thing you need to understand is what your organization's compliance requirements are, right, John? I mean, from there you start with your stakeholders and sit down and talk about in the business. You talk in the C-level folks in a large company or managers in a mid-sized company. You sit down with them and you talk about what's important. It's much like the process you go through for a risk assessment. You're trying to understand what is valuable in your organization and what do you need to protect. And sometimes that means you're always talking to suppliers and customers to identify and document any regulatory, legislative, or those kind of requirements. But then also, you need to talk about your internal IT security capabilities of your organization and what can you actually do to meet those requirements that you have.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Don. I mean, a lot of organizations will select the framework and they really have no idea of the amount of time and effort, and in some case, budgets that are required to become certified.
Right, it can be overkill, right?
Yeah, especially when you're talking about ISO. I mean, it's not an easy road to certification there. It can be very expensive and take a lot of time. So it's important, again, pick the framework that best fits your needs. There's lots of information out there. Much of it's free. It does take some time to kind of sift through all of it. But if you don't have the expertise in-house, there are lots of organizations that can help. I mean, reach out to someone that's got the expertise and has the experience that can guide you through the process. But it's something that you can definitely get started with by yourself. I mean, to look at some of the frameworks, I think Nist CSF is a good one for smaller organizations. There's also a list of controls called CIS, which are geared towards smaller organizations, geared towards small businesses. There's a top 20 CIS list. There's even, I think, a top 5 of the 5 most common and most beneficial controls to implement. So there's lots of information out there to help guide you.
Yeah, you don't have to struggle with it. I mean, as you said, John, you should start with self-education, because the more you know about it, the better you're going to be with it. But it's a big, wide, and complex world sometimes, and it's not. Once you've become educated, then it's not uncommon for someone to bring in an outside consultant or a coach or somebody that's seasoned with stuff like this. It doesn't have to be done, and in some ways that'll be done. You'll be able to get through it quicker, rather than slog through something and not understand if you're really, making the right choices. And
John, you can include some of those resources in the cybersecurity community.
Yeah, what we'll do is we'll upload a copy of this presentation, and then we've got some supporting documents. We'll upload to the resource section of the cybersecurity community. So just a quick plug here for the cybersecurity community.
That's right.
Check it out. Check it out. We'll provide a link to everyone after this meeting in the event they don't have it. But it was the site you needed to go to when you registered for this webinar. But check it out. There's lots of valuable resources there, and they're all free. You can download them.
In the meantime, we've got our next polling question. which is, which of the following best describes your IT security management framework for your organization? So if our audience here can give us a few ideas. Do you use standard frameworks? Do you have combined components from different frameworks that you've added? Have you developed kind of your own framework that you're going with, or do you just not have one? Yeah, it seems we've got some standard folks in there. Some folks not answering the question. There we go. All right, so mostly standard frameworks, but it looks like we have a few that have developed kind of their own ad hoc framework that they've put together. So now that we've gone through this and we've talked a little bit about frameworks, what is the recommended approach to develop a set of policies?
Well, I mean, as with managing any type of a complex, task, you need to break it down. I mean, you need to have a process in place. Following a risk-based approach tends to work well. We've used it on multiple engagements. Clients have had success in breaking something that's complex down into several phases or several steps. I mean, and don't be discouraged. I mean, it's not easy, and it does take some time and effort. You need to put the time in to understand, again, what your organization's needs are. I mean,
Yeah, well, it does take time, but I think, John, your point is that, I mean, this workflow you've got on the screen here, this is, you could apply it to project management, you could apply it to contract management, or risk management. But it's the basic idea that, you get management's help, you identify what the business requirements are, you create what you need wrapped around those requirements, and then you implement it and do it. I mean, and I think the next slides will show, we'll get into detail of that as well. But I think that's the core is something you can hang on to try to help you get through this more easily.
And as with any initiative, right? I mean, executive level buy-in is critical. I mean, right? You need to get the executive team on board because they're the ones that control the budget and they're the ones that own the resources. So, getting them behind this is really the first step. And keeping the business engaged throughout the entire process is another important step. I mean, information security is a company-wide issue.
Right.
Get the business engaged early. Look out for those, change agents on the business side. Get them involved, make them part of the process. Because when they become part of the development process, they now have some type of a vested interest in making this thing successful.
Well, and it's not unusual for somebody to bring in an outside person to help with this as well, and that helps engage this as well to get this started.
I mean, having someone who's considered impartial and someone who's gone through this before definitely helps, Don.
Yeah, a lot of times organizations get paralyzed at this stage because there's competing business departments, and they don't know how. There's a lot of inside politics going on, and sometimes bringing an outside person in to just kind of like cut through it really helps quite a bit. I'm not saying you have to do that, but it's something I've seen, a strategy I've seen some organizations do to get the buy-in from all the people all the departments or all the people that are competing for attention.
Mm-hmm. And to help demonstrate the value of what policies can deliver, I mean, start by addressing a known risk in the organization or compliance requirement, gap or challenge that exists. I mean, select something that you can easily quantify to illustrate, how important that is or what the potential impact to the business is of that risk. I mean, again, getting business leader support here is critical. Get them engaged early, make them, again, part of the process. And then once you've done that, I mean, you need to present whatever that whatever that case is, right? So outline those benefits. I mean, how is this policy going to address that particular risk or the potential impact to the business? Providing some context around, why you need to implement these policies helps to, define what that value is, and it makes it much easier, I think, for the executive team to understand what you're trying to achieve.
Right. And sometimes it's useful to take this, if you're usually there's somebody initiating this and is responsible for making this whole process happen. And, one of the things, one exercise that you can do ahead of a meeting or a series of meetings with all of these people is you probably already know what some of the issues are that your business is dealing with, but take that issue and walk through walk through this process John just outlined, and do it by yourself and work through that. And then you're prepared for when you walk into a meeting where you're dealing with a lot of people, and then you'll be able to use that as an example, and also it'll give you practice in working through the other issues that you're going to have to talk about.
Next up.
So yeah, kind of getting started, right? And I think we've touched on this already, but
yeah, looking at the requirements.
Understand what those requirements are. I mean, begin with what the compliance requirements are.
Yeah, very much. Again, we touched on that, but I mean, I think it's the next thing is as a key item though is the risk assessment, John. Mm-hmm. I mean, doing a risk assessment helps to identify. Once you understand your islands of data, so to speak, doing a risk assessment identifies, the security risks that your organization faces for that data, for those key critical assets that you have. And then you can, based on that, that'll help you determine what sort of security policy structure you want to organize around that, because you'll have a good idea of how you want to mitigate the risks for those assets. Some organizations implement global policies that can apply to anybody. Or they can get more granular as they go through this thing to address things more at a more minute detail. But I mean, that's the risk assessment is where, to me, is once you've identified, what you're trying to protect and how much you need to protect it, then, then it all falls in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then you can go ahead and pick your framework.
Yeah.
You've done that.
And it's easy, right?
Yeah. All right, so writing the policies, right? Creating policies. So I think you begin with, defining what are those specific actions and behaviors. We mentioned earlier about keeping the audience in mind when you create these. You don't want to include a lot of legal or technical jargon in a policy that's going to lull that reader to sleep. I mean, they need instructions of what they should be doing and when they should be doing it, and what's the consequences of not being compliant with that policy. And you're also going to want to identify things that may be out of scope, or requirements that you really can't implement that are going to be deferred to a later date, either because you don't have the resources or that something that you can't enforce.
That's right. And then but once you've got those policy requirements, then the next thing you really need to do is, as you say in the sliders, is prioritize them. Look at the ones, and I think most people do this naturally. You look at the high risk ones, the ones that are critical to the business first anyway. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't address the later ones, that the lesser important ones, the ones that are not maybe so critical to the business. I mean, you want to implement controls, or try to prioritize the controls based on any kind of maybe litigation in the event of a security incident that might take place. I mean, critical things that the organization needs to cover, critical assets where they might be exposed. I don't know, John, there's a saying among security professionals that's like, you need to say what you do and then do what you say. I know that's an old saw, but I think that's good advice to follow and want to prioritize.
I agree. I agree. I mean, we work with organizations who think that, or at least their leadership team believes that they've got a sound program in place because they have a policy, and in reality, they don't, because there's a policy with no controls, and there's no evidence that they're actually in compliance with those policies, but they
Right.
think they're secure because they've got a nice suite of policies that are defined, and everyone's read them and signed off on them, but in reality, they're at risk because there are no controls in place. Yeah, so this is just a list of some of the sections that you should have in your policy. I mean, there are plenty of templates available online for free, but these are the must-have sections, I would say. I mean, you need to have an approval block there, right? Someone of
Right.
authority needs to sign off on that policy, make it a mandate, a company mandate that everyone must follow, or whoever the policy applies to. You want some type of a revision log on there, right? So policies change, right, Don? I mean, it's not
Right. Oh,
something
yeah.
that's done, right?
You got to track how it's the whole concept of change management around this, right? And understanding the revisions is important.
And why that policy is being implemented. I mean, that's important. Provide some context around that, right? I think it helps with understanding, and also helps with enforcement if people understand why it is certain things are being asked of them. Define what the scope of that is. So what are you trying to protect? Who does the policy apply to? What are the roles and responsibilities around
Right.
that? Right. What the details are. So the specific actions or behaviors that need to be followed. It's important to have a compliance section, and Don just mentioned this on the previous slide. I mean, you need to be able to not only say what you're going to do, but also do what you say that you're going to do, and be able
Right.
to enforce that.
I think compliance out of these 9 bullets, I think compliance is like one of the. It would, if these were done in terms of importance, compliance would be enormous, because really it's compliance is all right. We did this. Now you got to prove that you did it. That's compliance, right? Or you got to show that you failed. That's non-compliance. So it comes back to later on when you do risk assessments. Are you meeting this? It's just if you can't, compliance allows you to give you compliance is about measuring what you're doing and then managing to that. And there's another old saw there, right? If you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
Mhm.
So compliance really is one of the key factors, I think, in any policy is, and making sure that, because later on, a year from now or 6 months from now, you're going to want to make sure that what you all spent time doing, putting these policies together, are have happened, and or how well it hasn't happened. And you can't do that unless there's a compliance component.
Mhm. Yeah. And then just some other sections, reference materials, right? You want to relate. You may have policies that are related to this policy or that are
Right.
dependent, any standards or frameworks that you're following. And it's always helpful to have some type of a glossary, especially when you're talking about things that are technical.
Right.
And I mean, and we see this often. Organizations try to create this one massive policy that's hundreds of pages long that tries to cover every possible scenario, and we kind of recommend against doing that. I mean, start with things that start on a smaller scale. I mean, once you've picked your framework, look at those control areas and develop a policy for each one. I mean, it makes the whole process of creating it simpler. It makes implementation easier. It makes the education piece simpler, and it also makes it a lot easier for you to enforce and update these policies. Because as we mentioned, I mean, this isn't a one and done type of thing. You should review your policies at least on a yearly basis, or whenever there's been any major change in technology or to the business.
Absolutely. And going back to what Joanne said early on in this presentation, was that sometimes policies are snooze material, right? They put you to sleep at bedtime, but there may be parts of it that have to be dealing with a regulatory that is like, yeah, okay, this is contractual, you have to put this into, but to your point, John, all these things is you really need to you need clarity. in these things because of everything you just said. You need to train them. You need to understand. Everybody needs to understand them, and so it's got to be concise and clear. And it shouldn't put you to sleep. I mean, okay, yeah, there are sleepy parts, just like there is in any novel, but it should be easy to read and understand.
What strikes me on this slide, if I may, is that easier to update and easier to introduce new policies, which was probably very important when 2020 started going into full force and suddenly people were working from home that had never worked from home before.
Certainly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very much.
Had to be made.
Yeah, the world's been stood on end because of the pandemic, at least people coming home and working from home. And I'm really, frankly, not sure everyone has caught up their policies to match the new work environment that's there. But again, to your point, John, if the original policies were easy to understand, they would be easy to update, easy to get approval, and easier to introduce new policies. And that's really the key. Because right now, I imagine a lot of businesses, people are out there working freeform in this new environment. Not using. I mean, you're sharing, as an example, you're sharing your network at home, your Wi-Fi at home with your kids who are going to school, with your spouse who's going to work, and who knows what's on there doing what, and hopefully you're using a VPN to access your work, but is that mandated? Is there security on your laptop? There's a myriad of things that policies that might be changed because you're working from home.
Yeah. No, good point, Joanne.
Okay, so then I guess we've talked about this, right, John, about, when you've got the main thing is implementing them. And the key part of implementing is to have effective security awareness training. That's the key to the users are at the core of any successful security implementation. And around that is the training. And you have to be able to train all employees on how to comply with the policies that you've set forth and the things that the business is trying to accomplish with their security plans. There's a lot of ways to successfully train them, and you can to help make it easier. You can demonstrate how policies align with the business and goals as part of the training. You can make it interactive or role-based, game-based. They do gamification these days of these sort of training scenarios where but you still need to come back and emphasize the importance of following security policy. So you would probably in such training cover the frameworks that you're using and why you're using them but again, this gets into the snoozing of you don't want people to fall asleep, but you do want them to understand why you're choosing to ask them to do these things. Because it's important to not treat users as idiots. And so often in the security industry or the technology industry, we all treat users as like, the users, they're always the problem. Well, they're not. They're the solution. And that's the way you need to look at it. So at the end of this, all employees should feel empowered by this to understand what they need to do to make, the world a better place within the organization in terms of security.
Those are good points. You need to train that workforce, and they need to understand what their role and what their responsibility is. And I think we kind of rushed through the last two items that were on that slide, but that's all right. One was around the implementation, and that's really where that rubber meets the road, right? You've done the homework, you've put together the policies, you've created them, you've gotten them approved, but how do you implement them? Right, and I think you need to take a phased approach. Everyone's got a full-time job, and reading policies is something that is, while it's necessary and required in some cases, it's something else the team has to do.
Right.
Don and I know you've worked in regulatory environments as well as I have, and I've been bombarded with policy updates on a weekly basis, but it's something that I've had to do. It's something that was mandated, and in many organizations, we've got a set time to read and acknowledge that policy, and if you don't, your immediate supervisor gets a notification within a day or two, then it just continues to go up the chain. So you need to keep that in mind when you roll this out. not only for the people that are implementing all this, but for the end user who needs to to go through this, read it, understand it, acknowledge it. So try to control that implementation as you mentioned earlier, Don, focus on what those big risks are, or the ones that you think are going to potentially, deliver the greatest amount of value there. And
Well, and it's key, John. To your point, it's key that they spend time making sure that how they implement it and how they enforce it is not overwhelming to the users as well. I mean, you can't just sit there and throw, and I know companies do this. You can't just sit there and throw policy after policy of of this dense gray text out to people and expect them to understand it. You need to take the time to not overwhelm your users in that regard.
Mhm. Yeah, and the enforcement piece, right? I mean,
Oh yeah, absolutely. It all ties together to that. Yes.
yeah. All right. So just to kind of wrap up here, begin by getting support from the executive level and engage the business. I mean, get them involved early, get those decision makers and those agents of change on board, make them part of the process. Identify what your requirements are. What do you need to be compliant to? What specific regulations, whether they're industry regulated requirements or legislative, what those obligations are. We talked earlier about prime contractors working with the U.S. government. I mean, if you're a subcontractor and you're doing work for a prime, you need to understand that you're gonna be in the same position that they are. You're going to need to provide evidence that you're in compliance with the Nist framework. Create your policies, and the enforcement piece is key in how you choose to roll this out. I mean, it can be a complicated process, but again, there's lots of information that's out there. Approach it as you approach implementing any other new initiative within the organization. And if you need help, reach out.
Yeah, it's a complex process, but it doesn't have to be difficult to do.
I think that's pretty much our slides, right, Joanne? I think we have a Q&A. We still have some time.
Yes, we do. Next up we do have a couple of questions, which actually ties into enforcement. We did have a question about how can a policy be enforced? Is there a software rather than a human effort that can be utilized to enforce policies?
Mhm.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways. It depends on what you're talking about, but I mean, there are examples of that out in the world now where you have virus protection that protects your system. But I mean, there are a large number there's software for anything you can imagine these days that locks down. But I mean, it comes down. Go ahead, John.
No, I think that was Joanne. Did you have something?
Oh,
I was
Joanne.
just saying, hey, there's software for everything, and
Yeah, it's hard to answer the question, but there are softwares out there depending on the situation, and there may not be. I mean, a lot of times it's enforcement can be a laborious process of, okay, now we got to go read the logs for the last 5 days to see if and very often there are processes, as an example, that will read the logs for specific things that happen. Maybe too many people logging in with the wrong password, or there's a myriad of ways you can cut that. So yeah, the answer to the question is there is software, and then sometimes it's more work.
And there's some product vendors that we're working with who are taking a kind of new approach to this. And what they're doing is they're using machine learning and artificial intelligence, and they're taking a policy and they're looking at those controls that map back to that policy, and then they're collecting data to help determine whether or not the workforce is compliant. So, for example, if users aren't to be, if they shouldn't be logging in after a certain hour of the day, right, and all of a sudden folks are beginning to log in, I mean, that not only triggers an alert, but it can also shut down that user's machine. So there's a lot of exciting things on the forefront there of how AI and machine learning can help to identify, risks there and issues even before they've become an issue.
Yeah, that's getting into everything these days, John. AI and machine learning, it's slowly trickling down to small and business and mid-sized businesses.
And looking for a solution there that software is gonna provide. I mean, that's only a piece of it. There needs to be some technical knowledge, some experience there. I mean, you can look at system logs, you can look at firewall rules, but you need to have someone sitting there who understands what needs to be done and how to tweak it.
Well, and a lot of times, John, in a organization, what you were talking about the new AI related security is that it helps for smaller businesses that don't have the staffing to do the sort of checking, and that's another. It makes it much more flexible. I mean, and then also having a SOC in place, a security operations center, that is monitoring your systems on a regular basis. I mean, that seems like it's for a small business, it might seem like overkill, but there are organizations that provide that service now. And it's very useful because they can monitor your systems and alert you when there's a security breach of some sort that might be related to your policies.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
I think we have time for maybe, oh, sorry, go ahead, Don.
No, I was going to say much like larger organizations have now, but go ahead, Joanne.
I think we have time for one more question, which is, should a company do a cybersecurity audit before or after they develop a policy plan?
Both.
When John, you want to take it?
Yeah, I would say both, right? I mean, do an audit, do a risk assessment of what where the business currently is, and then do one after.
Yeah.
And implement those policies. And, it's not a one and done kind of thing, right? I mean, you should be doing a risk assessment at least once a year or whenever there's a major change.
Well, and it's a lot easier to do a risk assessment. I mean, of course you do a risk. Ideally, John, you're absolutely right. You do it both front and back of a policy development. But it's easier to do. It is easier to do after the policies have been developed, because then you know what targets you're trying to hit, right? These are the things we want to really focus on in these risk assessments. But again, if you doing it before and after really helps give you the management metrics you need to understand, how well you're doing. It goes back to that slide we were talking about earlier, John, about all the different things that are part of components of a policy, and it's the compliance element of it that I was sitting there drilling in on. I think the compliance relates to this security assessment as well.
Okay, one last quick one. Do I need to have a policy regarding consequences for anyone who consistently fails to follow policies?
Yes. Yes. Well, I mean, I go back to the war story I told earlier about the organization that had the person who looked at intellectual property, got into it someplace he wasn't supposed to be, and they had no way to enforce it. Yes, you need to have something that has consequences. Otherwise, your organization is at risk to not be able to do something about a person like that. You can fire them, but in some states, or some areas, you can fire them, but you don't have cause. And if it's against your policies, against your rules for somebody to be doing that, then you, in some places, you have a right to do that. You have a right to fire them. You can build the consequences in, and you can protect your business. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think so. I can't think of a situation. Can you, John, of where you wouldn't want to have consequences?
No, and I think you should define it in each. And I think we had compliance as a section on our policy template there. I mean, it should be clearly defined. I mean, what's the consequence of nonconformance? And most of the major frameworks all have an HR or a security personnel policy. I mean, it should be clearly stated in there. If someone is repeatedly, not in compliance, I mean, it needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and just on a side note, HR is an important component of any policy development. That they will be definitely. If you've got an HR department or director, they'll be heavily involved in anything that you're doing.
Well, I think that about wraps it up. Our time is just about up. I want to thank everybody for joining us today and remind you to visit our cybersecurity community. We'll be sending you that link again after the event. Probably give us a day to send everything out. And if you have any questions at all, or if anything comes to mind, please feel free to email John, and we'll be happy to help you. And I thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you, Joanne. Thanks, everyone. Have a good
Thanks.
day.